Hi everyone. I haven't done this in a while, so please bear with me. I may be a little nervous actually. I'm doing my talk on contemplative practices of cognition in Jung's red book, Liber, Novus. So the red book is Jung's record of what he called his confrontation with the unconscious. That's the chapter that I put up into the readings for this week from Memories, Dreams, Reflections. And the full story can be found in a few places. That chapter itself. Jung, also there's a seminar from 1925 which is called Introduction to Analytical Psychology, which is really wonderful. It's the one time that Jung attempted to teach his psychology from the work that he did, his personal work in the Red Book. After that, he decided he didn't want to do the personal teaching, and he went to teaching stuff like alchemy and other religious traditions. And then also in Sona Shamdasani's introduction to the Red Book, it's about 100 pages, really worth reading. And then the Red Book itself. So after Jung had a really acrimonious falling out with Freud, he began having horrific visions, which he later understood to be precognitive visions of World War I. And around the same time, he entered into an extramarital affair with Toni Wolff, who was a woman who carried really powerfully for him his own animal projection. She became kind of a soul figure for him. And the Red Book, in a lot of ways, is really a journey to rediscover his soul. He had become kind of overly masculinized, if I can put it in gender terms, but certainly far to one side, and he had lost touch with his own soul. These marked a period of crisis in which he undertook what he called his experiment to plumb the depths of his own psyche, and the product of these experiments was the Red Book. So I want to share a little bit about this work and explore its relationship to cognitive practices. It was most especially the visions of the universal deluge of blood and filth flooding Europe that turned Jung inward. And at first he feared that he might be what they called back in that day doing a psychosis. But then World War I broke out and he realized that something else was going on. He was having this collective vision. And the revelation that his own psyche was somehow connected in the depths to the collective psyche of the world convinced him to begin this cognitive experiment, which led to his developing a technique of working with his own unconscious, which he later came to call active imagination or chemical active imagination. And through active imagination, he charted his own psyche and clarified for himself the ideas that he would spend the rest of his life attempting to refine and teach. And he said in MDR, a collective problem, if not recognized as such, always appears as a personal problem, and definitely be the soul. So in the prologue to Memories, Dreams, Reflections, he states that in the end, the only events of his life that were really worth telling in this semi-autobiography were those when the imperishable world erupted into this transitory one. So if you read that book, it's a really wonderful primer in just that, seeing life as a succession of events where the unconscious or higher consciousness, however you want to put it, kind of erupt into normal everyday consciousness. And as he later wrote about this period in his life when he came to understand the interdependence of the conscious and the unconscious in the psyche, the years when I was pursuing my inner images were the most important in my life. In them, everything essential was decided. It all began then. The later details are only supplements and clarifications of the material that burst forth from the unconscious and at first swamped me. It was the prima materia for a lifetime's work. Prima materia is a term that comes from alchemy. It's the material that you have to work on, the primal material that you work on in order to create the philosopher's stone. So this is just an etymology. I took this from Merriam-Webster's dictionary, the etymology of cognition itself, because we're talking about cognitive practices, and embedded in there are these kind of definitions of the term cognition. But zeroing in on those terms, really what it comes down to is that cognition has to do with mental practices, which is really essentially the subject matter of psychology. In this week's module, we're looking at practices of cognition and reading and narrative, which I think that Jung's writings fall really well into those categories. And as an example, Debashish listed the Mahavakyas. And please correct me if I'm wrong, but the Mahavakyas, as I understand them, are the great sayings of the Upanishads. And generally, there are 4 that are considered the great Mahavakyas, right? And that's, I can't pronounce that. So, yeah.
Well, actually, there's different traditions. There's not only 4, but according to some traditions, there's 4.
Yes, I think that this was in the Advaita tradition, right? That
The Advaita tradition.
they consider these the 4 maybe most important.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing about this is that one comes from each of the 4 Vedas. And I was wondering if it's a scaffolded process, because you go from knowing is Brahma, the ultimate reality, to the self is the ultimate reality, to you are the ultimate reality, thou art that, to I am the ultimate reality. And ultimately, the idea is that the knowledge of Brahma is Brahma. Let's see. Jung wrote about Brahman in the type problem in poetry. So this essay, The Type Problem in Poetry, which is in psychological types, I would recommend to everyone to read. It's, I think, one of his most important essays.
Can you repeat the name?
It's called The Type Problem in Poetry, and it's in psychological types. Each of the chapters is entitled The Type Problem in, The Type Problem in. This one's in poetry, and he's looking at a poem by a man named Spittler on Prometheus and Epimetheus, but he uses it as a springboard to go into the kind of like the psychological and symbolic nature of spiritual awakening. It's a really extraordinary essay, and it comes right out of the experiences that led him to write the Red Book. He talks about Brahman as the transcendental goal of the process of spiritual awakening, in particular Indian tradition. And he says in the Type Problem in Poetry, Brahman is the union and dissolution of all opposites, and at the same time stands outside them as an irrational factor. It's therefore wholly beyond cognition and comprehension. It's a divine entity, at once the self and a definite psychological state characterized by isolation from the flux of affects, and that isolation from the flux of affects Jung saw as one of the goals of yoga. Another cognitive practice would be the reading and elucidation of sutras. So sutras can be short and aphoristic, or as in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, where you take a very short statement and then you kind of unpack it to understand it, or in some longer texts. For instance, the Heart Sutra. This is an image of the Heart Sutra that you see here, which was the Buddha's great discourse on form and emptiness. So the Red Book is both a record of Jung's practice, and it's also a public document, so it kind of fulfills these 2 roles. Originally, he didn't want it published, but now that it's published and it's there for us to see it, it's also a document which can be approached as a cognitive practice akin to sutra practice, or sutra reading. Its aphoristic quality lends itself to reading in a way that's akin to what we see in the Mahavakyas. And just as an example, here's just one little snippet that I pulled out, one of my favorite statements from the book. The knowledge of the heart is in no book, and is not to be found in the mouth of any teacher, but grows out of you like green seed from the dark earth. So they're really evocative statements, and you can just use them as meditations. Here's another example. The Red Book is kind of a poetic externalization of the rigorous work that Jung undertook to plumb his own depths. And it's my experience that it has the capacity to catalyze the same processes in the reader. And I know many people who read Jung say the same thing, that you start reading Jung in your dream life erupts, and you begin to kind of have synchronicities in your life where before you may not have noticed them. So there's definitely power, and I think that power is because of the intensity of his own engagement with the process. And it translates when you're reading his writing. So I'm looking at the Red Book in the light of cognitive practices, and among these are reading and narrative practices. Here are some examples of ways of reading religious texts that frame them in terms of levels or types of engagement. So in the Jewish tradition, there's something called pardes, and they take the Jewish tradition. They love to take words and look at the individual consonants of the word, or sometimes flip the word around, or expand or extend it. In this PRDS, Peshat, Ramez, Darash, and Sod are the literal, symbolic, comparative, and esoteric levels of reading, respectively. Augustine, in his writings, talked about the literal, allegorical, moral, and eschatological levels of reading. In the Lectio Divina, which originates with Origen, with the Church Father Origen, there's Lectio, which is to read, Meditatio, which is to meditate on, it's Oratio, to pray, Contemplatio, which is to contemplate. Dante had a system also for reading his Divine Comedy, the literal, allegorical, moral, and anagogical or mystical. And so I just want to highlight here Jung's levels that can be discerned in the text, the descriptive, conceptual, and prophetic, and this is something that the translators of the text point out. Whether Jung intended this or not, I'm not sure, but they were able to discern these different levels of meaning. I know that essentially I'll read to you exactly what it was that he was doing. He was aware of the technique that he developed, but whether those specific terms were terms that he used, I don't know. So I'm going to read this to you. It's a mouthful, but I think it's worth hearing. The language in Liber Novus is often used interchangeably with the Red Book. The Red Book is the new book, Liber Novus. It pursues three main stylistic registers. One of them faithfully reports the fantasies and inner dialogues of Jung's imaginal encounters, while a second remains firmly and discerningly conceptual. Still a third writes in a mantic and prophetic or romantic and dithyrambic, which means exalted, mode. That mode got Jung into a lot of trouble. People think that he was attempting to create his own religion. He was a prophet of his own religion, but he debunks that in the Red Book itself. Within each chapter, the descriptive, conceptual, and mantic registers consistently rub against each other, while at the same time no single register is affected by its partners. All three stylistic registers serve psychic promptings, and each chapter shares a polyphonic mode with the others. This design was not premeditated, but rather grew from the experiments to which Jung arduously submitted. Each time he sets down an initial protocol layer of narrative encounter, usually with dialogue, and then in the second layer, a lyrical elaboration of and commentary on that encounter. The first layer avoids an elevated tone, whereas the second welcomes elevation and modulates into sermonic, romantic, prophetic reflections on the episode's meaning, which in turn unpack events discursively. So this mode of composition, which is unique in his works, was no temperamental arrangement. Instead, as the episodes accumulated and their stakes mounted, it grew into an experiment that was as much literary as it was psychological and spiritual. So I'm going to be reading a chapter, actually, from the Red Book to you in a little while later, and I'm going to ask you to kind of listen to see if you can discern the different registers in the passage. So as the Red Book operates on different levels, as a record of Jung's own self-exploration, it's also an instrument that can catalyze transformation. Taken in its parts or as a whole, it's a profound exploration of the nature of what he called the transcendent function. This is from his essay. His essay on the transcendent function was written in 1916. The Red Book itself, his experiment kind of went 1912, 13, all the way to 1929, about 16 years of his life. So right in the initial stages of it, when he had already kind of collected most of the material for this and was sifting through it, he realized that he wanted to attempt to create a kind of a theoretical understanding of it, and he wrote this essay on the transcendent function, which he didn't publish until the 1950s. And in it, he asked the question, how does one come to terms in practice with the unconscious? So this is a question posed by the philosophies of India, and particularly by Buddhism and Zen. Indirectly, it's a fundamental question in practice of all religions and all philosophies, for the unconscious is not this thing or that, it is the unknown as it immediately affects us. So as I said before, his precognitive visions of World War I led him to see that there was a connection between the individual and collective events. And to understand this more completely, he undertook this kind of period of rigorous self-analysis. And at some point in this process, he reached the collective level of his own psyche. And when he got to the collective level of his own psyche, he found that it was populated by beings, mythological beings. And at first he was willing to write them off as fantasies until one of them told him, you can write us off as fantasies if you like, but we're just as real as you are. He learned through these encounters to take his psyche extremely seriously and his unconscious seriously. He always said that what people don't understand about his particular way of looking at psychology is that he saw the psyche as an ontologically real thing, as real as matter, as real as the spirit. So Shamdasani tells us that Jung wrote an exposition of the collective, superpersonal, absolute unconscious, these terms being used interchangeably. Jung argued that one needed to separate oneself from the unconscious by presenting it visibly as something separate. He saw it as imperative that one learn to differentiate oneself from the figures in this mythological layer, of distinguishing the I from the not I. These archetypal figures he called dominance. I want to say psychic dominance, unconscious dominance. This need to distinguish or discriminate the dominance in relationship to oneself and also to one another turns on the problem of opposites. This image itself comes from the Red Book. It's actually a very small painted image. The figure on the right, I believe, is Jung, and then the figure in the center is Elijah. And the figure on the right is Salome. Elijah represents everythh from Jung's kind of shadow to the wisdom figure, the Mana personality, and later transforms into Philemon, who is kind of a wizard figure. And Salome represents his animal, or his soul. She also undergoes many transformations and appears in different guises as different female figures throughout. In the beginning, she starts out as blind, and she's being led by Elijah. And he talks often of the senex puer relationship, and how in Gnosticism and in many traditions, there is this ideal of the older man and the younger woman traveling together. And he said that there are psychological undercurrents and overtones in this relationship. These figures played out the conflicts that existed within his own psychic structure, and he said that some of these conflicts could be inherited historically. For instance, the French Revolution, which with its overemphasis on rationalism, he said, directly led to the eruption of chaos and brutality of the First World War. He also talked about how colonialism led Europeans to unconsciously appropriate many traits, cultural and otherwise, from those that they colonized, thus undermining their own authentic cultural norms. And he said personal challenges could also be inherited from one's ancestors. So the ancestral line is also extremely important. And in some ways, we have to live the unlived life of our ancestors. This is a question that comes back in the Red Book. It's in Memories, Truths, Reflections. He had many kind of encounters with people from the past, and especially his own lineage. Well, under normal circumstances, the psyche is a self-regulating system, and the engine of that system is the opposites, the psychic opposites, which kind of keep things propelling forward or moving forward. When the natural balance breaks down, as it did for Jung, the symbol producing function of the psyche is no longer effective. Intervention becomes necessary to catalyze the process, so that intervention can come within an analyst-analysand relationship, but it could also be like a guru-chila relationship. But if your container is broken, then it becomes necessary to actually do some work to get back into balance, to psychic balance. He called this the mill of opposites, and one way of describing the mill of opposites is through the opposition of what he termed creative formulation and understanding. Where creative formulation dominates, there's a tendency to overvalue the surface, and where understanding dominates, there's a tendency to overvalue the unconscious. The surface, I mean the surface consciousness. So when the conscious and the unconscious are held together, as he put it, the two supplement each other to form the transcendent function. In the same way that the ego suppressed the unconscious before, the liberated unconscious can thrust the ego aside and overwhelm it. This is one of the warnings that he gives especially about adopting practices from other cultures that aren't part of our own. That our ego is somehow formed within the container of our own culture. If we seek outside that culture, those things that might bring another person in another culture to the brink of transformation might actually overwhelm our ego. Jung was not an advocate of ego dissolution at all. Just as the conscious mind of civilized man has a restrictive effect on the unconscious, so the rediscovered unconscious often has a really dangerous effect on the ego. So either way, if you move into an imbalance, too much ego or too much unconscious, something's lost. Jung always advocated for kind of a middle path. He said, through one-sidedness, the psyche disintegrates and loses its capacity for cognition. It becomes an unreflective because unreflectable succession of psychic states, each of which fancies itself its own justification because it does not or does not yet see any other state. His method was intended to bring about psychic wholeness, neither pure aestheticism nor pure intellectual analysis, neither mystical ego disillusion nor materialism, but rather a state in which all the psychic functions remain at our disposal. And he wrote, the confrontation with the unconscious must be a many-sided one, for the transcendent function is not a partial process running a conditioned course. It's a total and integral event in which all aspects are or should be. I think this is really important to understand about Jung, that he was attempting to help his clients and also, I mean, himself through his own work in the Red Book to achieve something that he considered psychic. Ultimately, as Jung said, the shuttling to and fro of arguments and affects represents the transcendent function of opposites. The confrontation of the two positions generates a tension charged with energy and creates a living third thing, a living birth that leads to a new level of being, a new situation. This living third thing first appears to us as a symbol. He says of the symbol that it's the best possible expression for a complex fact, not yet clearly apprehended by consciousness. By the way, I probably should have told you at the beginning, all these illustrations that I'm showing, for those who haven't seen it, are from the Red Book. These are Jung's own. These were his mandalas. For a period in his life, he was painting mandalas every single day, and he eventually discovered that he was painting the development of his own relationship to himself. The raw material shaped by thesis and antithesis, this is the opposites, right? And in the shaping of which the opposites are united, is the living symbol. The symbol is alive, he wants us to understand, only so long as it's pregnant with meaning. If the symbol loses its ability to lift us beyond the opposites, the psyche must find a substitute or run the risk of losing the sense of meaningfulness. And in a rather chilling passage in Mysterium Cognitionis, he wrote, the unconscious has 1,000 ways of snuffing out a meaningless existence with surprising swiftness. By meaningless existence, he doesn't mean that the person isn't worth anything. It's not a value statement. It means your own sense of inner meaning. If you lose that, if you lose touch with that, you become endangered. And he gives many examples throughout his career of people who, for instance, at retirement, when their entire psychic structure was affected to the job that they had. They saw themselves as that job. When they gave that up, they lost all sense of meaning. They would die young. They would get into an accident. It was pretty extraordinary, the kinds of things that he saw in his practice on a daily basis. So he himself, in 1913, was in such danger because of these visions that he was having, because his marriage was in danger, and he had entered into this very kind of this relationship with Tony Wolff, which could have gone either way with his wife, and also because he was pregnant with Freud. So he was kind of in crisis. Many people think that he had a psychotic break, but he said no, that he didn't. He thought at first that this might be happening, but then he undertook this experiment consciously and deliberately. And he was asking himself this very simple question: what is the myth that you live by? He realized that the container for him was broken, and he was living his existence was kind of meaningless. What he found after years of intense inner work was the symbol of order and meaning, the self, which he said is pictured, if you want to have an image of it, a repeated image that comes up within people's unconscious. And he worked with many, many, many people, talking about their dreams and their visions for many years as a therapist. He said it's pictured as a mandala. And citing Goethe, he wrote, only gradually did I discover what the mandala really is: formation, transformation, eternal minds, eternal recreation, right? Recreation, but also recreation. And this is the self, the wholeness of the personality, which if all goes well is harmonious, but which cannot tolerate self-deception.
At some point, maybe.
Yeah, I have only like 2 more slides.
Is it a really dense material?
Yeah, 2 more slides. I'm presenting really dense because I want you to get the different. There are a few different points that I want you to get as you listen to the teaching. But he wrote that the self is the principle and archetype of orientation and meaning, and therein lies its healing function. For him, or for me, this is Jung speaking, this insight signified an approach to the center and therefore to the goal, and out of it emerged the first inkling of his personal myth. This is the Systema Munditodius, which is from the Red Book. It was a visual analog to the 7 Sermons to the Dead, which appears, it's really the kind of the high point, the culmination of the Red Book. He published it separately in his youth, but it's really meant to be encapsulated within the Red Book. And this is a later attempt at kind of describing this from his book Ion, which is subtitled Researches into the Phenomenology of the Self. Jung wrote that indications of the process of symbol formation are to be found in the scanty records of the conflicts experienced by the founders of religion during the initiation period, and I would argue that this is the real subject of the Red Book, that symbol formation through the transcendent function catalyzed Jung's own initiation into the mysteries of the psyche. So I'm going to read you a section. We can have a little discussion, and I want to read a section of the Red Book, and I just want to point out that there are kind of what I would like you to have as kind of takeaways from the talk, which I went through really quickly, is that there are 3 levels of, 3 things mostly. First, the idea of a confrontation with the unconscious, the necessity to contact it and to remain in contact with it if we're going to be whole and healthy. The idea of the mill of opposites, which leads to the transcendent function, that whatever it is that we think is happening, there's always a shadow side to it. There's always the opposite that's happening. If there's good, there's evil. If there's light, there's dark. And that these functioning within the psyche are the engine that drives psychic development. And also that there are 3 registers or levels of meaning in the text. So that's it.
That was amazing.
I know it was a mouthful.
Questions, comments, deconstructions?
So much.
Yeah. I'm sure I'm going to add more things to say. First, fantastic, and thank you. I've heard about the Red Book, but I haven't really sat. You gave me a very good reason to really look more into it. So thank you for that. And again, I'm still digesting it, but I'm reacting to the word confrontation with the unconscious. Does it have to be a confrontation? Because the confrontation seems to me somewhat violent, and I know his was in a way. The crisis period we're talking about, but I'm puzzled by the word, I guess.
The first thing that pops into my head is that if you read Memories, Dreams, Reflections, he tells you that all through his childhood, he was constantly drawing and painting pictures of battle, and that also he couldn't keep friends because he was a really confrontational human being. So it's possible that he had to see it in that way because it was part of his psychic makeup. But I don't know whether he was explicit about this in his work. The other thing is that if you read the Red Book, you find that even though his initial reaction to kind of meeting his soul after so many years of working in the sciences and kind of pushing he had an artistic temperament as a kid. He drew and painted. He had a very soulful life growing up, and he decided to become a scientist. He pushed all that away. When the soul came back, it was a love experience, and it was at that time that he that he fell in love with Tony Wolff, and she carried his anima projection for him. But after a while, he and the anima began having arguments because he realized that she's not, she wanted to kind of usurp his decision-making capacity, his will. She wanted to replace his own personal will, and he begins fighting with her. And as you move on in the book, their relationship becomes a little bit more contentious. It's very interesting. And he felt that all of these dominants within the unconscious have got to be, they have to understand that they're part of your psychic makeup and you're not part of theirs. So he felt that there had to be a certain amount of control exercised over them. That's the importance of the ego. You know, he didn't believe in dissolution of the ego. He believed that the ego was absolutely essential. And the ego is kind of like this point within the self at which all things are focused, right? And so I think that, I don't know if that answers your question, but I think it's a few things, because if your temperament doesn't tend in that direction, your relationship to the unconscious might not be so confrontational. And then the one final thing that I might add is that because of Jung and his work, 107 years down the line, we don't have people, especially in this school, people who find their way to CIIS don't have the same lack that Jung had in living in a patriarchal, scientistic, positivistic period where an overly masculinized period, we had to actually break through all that social conditioning to get into the depths.
I think that's why it's important to look at it as a kind of as Jung's, presentation, and not yours.
Yeah.
It's not a teaching, in other words.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, he says that in the Red Book, just in the opening of the Red Book, he says, "This is not a teaching that I give you. This is my own path. You must follow your own path."
Perhaps one of the reasons I'm reacting to the word, and again, that was just the first thing that came out to mind, is because in clinical work we talk about the defense mechanisms, and so you don't obliterate the defenses, you don't attack the defenses, you don't go against them, because and that was also a very Freudian thing to do, right? You have to conquer the unconscious, right? You have to submit the id in a way, so that there may be some of it too in the way this forceful, perhaps very male, very masculine way of conquering, confronting with the unconscious. Anyway, there was no question, it was more like
Sergio, I think the word confrontation, it may not be to the meaning itself as you're looking at it, and I would think as well confrontation. If you want to look at memories, dreams, and reflections, there is a chapter on confrontation with the unconscious. And over there, to him, the unconscious, he's talking about dreams. And to him, because the dreams is coming from the unconscious. And what he's doing when his patients would come from a therapeutic point of view and talk to him about the dreams that they had, he wouldn't give them an answer. So his confrontation, if we want to use that word, was for them to come up with the answers themselves to what the dreams were. And for that, I would read this. I avoided all theoretical points of view and simply helped the patients to understand the dream images by themselves. That's what he was.
But in his own personal process, which is what the Red Book is all about. It's all about his personal process and how he arrived at this. He did have an antagonistic relationship with his unconscious to a certain degree.
For himself, okay.
So there was this pull and push and polarities, and so I think that's why he chose that word, confrontation, because it was not an alliance with the unconscious or a dance with the unconscious. It was a power struggle between the different parts of his psyche.
Yeah, I haven't read the Red Book, but I read this one, and this is what I saw, and it's in our reading for today's chapter as well. So yeah, and it made sense from a point of view, that we don't give the answers to our clients, that we have them come to whatever their thinking or their thoughts are. But I see what you're saying as well, Isabel, because yes, from what you are also, that he could have had a psychotic episode himself from everything that he was going with, that he developed this confrontational with himself, that he might have been in confrontation with his own ego.
You could also look at it in terms of he was confronted with a reality that he was not prepared to see, even though he was a psychiatrist.
A lot of his work also is about, that which is disavowed. So those are confrontations because he wants to press them down and push them away. I'm thinking about the story in Memory Jung's reflections about the image. He kept having an image in his mind, but he didn't want to see the image to his end. So whenever that thing popped up, he would just say, I'm not gonna go there. I'm not gonna go there. And then one day he's like, okay, I can't not imagine the thing that I want to imagine. And he does, and it's God sitting on a big toilet, shitting down onto humanity. And so it was a confrontation because he feels, because of his training, because of positivism, that those things can't be real. So they were like a bubbling up, eruption of things that he doesn't know where to contain it, where to hold it. So I think the word confrontation seems appropriate to confronting the shadow aspects, the part of us that we think we shouldn't have. We should only be good and not evil. So I feel like the word confrontation is really appropriate for my experience as well.
And he had spent years working with clients and patients, and he was in a mental institution with severely psychotic patients, and he understood them intellectually, but he didn't really understand them viscerally, and he realized he had to undergo this experiment in order to get at the roots of his own psychology. And so it was a pretty frightening experience for him, because many times during the course of this, he felt like he might be losing his mind, because he was seeing things about himself that he didn't really necessarily want to see.
One thing that I'm always curious about Jung is his resistance to the ego dissolution, and I think that this really, I think that his positivist aspect won out in that sense, this fear of not being able to come back. And I think that, the image that comes to mind, I don't remember what these were called, but remember those balls, you had as a kid? It was a set of metal balls that you start really high and they come out.
Yeah.
And eventually, it evens out and it keeps on going at the same rate. And I feel that if you have an imbalance that's really critical, you're going to have, when you open up a channel, you can have another imbalance on the other side, but eventually it returns. And at some point, you probably, if you continue working mindfully with this stuff, you find homeostasis. You find a place where it centers. And you have the possibility of dissolving the ego and have it reconfigure into something that's healthier, rather than the trying to add different pieces from the unconscious to an ego that is petrified. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So I feel that in a way that was a loss for him. This fear of the ego dissolution, because had he gone there, I can only imagine what he might have come up with.
What about the possibility of rebirth experiences? Does he talk about that?
Yeah, he actually wrote an essay on rebirth, which is really fascinating because he looks at it in many different ways. What do we mean when we talk about rebirth? There is a chapter in here called Death, where he confronts death. And I think that, like, if you look at, I put this is in my dissertation actually, if you look at the Zen ox herding pictures, the 8th image is an empty circle, right? That, to me, as I understand that as your consciousness shifts from seeing things in one particular way to then having that expanded awareness, enlightenment, if you want to call it that there is this moment where everything dissolves and then reconfigures. And I think you'll find that in Jung's work. I think that what he was talking about is samadhi states as he understood them, with his limited understanding, which wasn't so limited, but by today's standards, he had much less access to texts and teachers. But he felt that like the goal of yogic practice was the dissolution of the ego, and I don't think that that's actually the goal of yogic practice. It's a sign point along the way, or a signpost along the way, and I even found, because my dissertation is on Jung and the mother, I even found in Sri Aurobindo and the mother's work this idea that it's not about ego dissolution.
It's also a question of what you're calling the ego.
What is it, what is actually defined?
How do you define the ego, or how does he define the ego?
It's not Freud's, it's not the embattled.
Yeah, no, not only that, but it's also the kind of, see, the reason I brought up the issue of the rebirth is that a kind of full-fledged rebirth experience can completely reconfigure what you thought was the ego. Because you don't belong to this time anymore.
Right.
You don't belong to this life. Even the notion that this culture has to be something that is the focus through which we filter the unconscious stops making sense.
Well, I think that this documents his rebirth. But I want to acknowledge what you're saying, because
But I'm talking about actual rebirth experiences where one sees that one has lived many other kinds of lives.
But he does talk about
The culture
more
But this culture no longer, the ancestry is no longer the ancestry of this culture.
Yes, thank you for saying that.
I don't know that he talked about went back that far or out of the culture. For instance, he said that he felt if he were reborn, that he saw himself as a student of the Baal Shem Tov. It's still European culture. It was Liber. I don't know if he went back any further than that.
But he did have that practice when he was a little boy of the figure in the box. That was also a practice from some other culture that he discovered later in his life. So he really was a mystic, in my opinion.
And he had these archaeological dreams where he would go back further and further and further in time, and uncovering layers of humanity, but I think he was uncovering his own layers. And he said that each of us has within us what he called a 2 million-year-old man, right? This 2 million-year-old being that begins with the awakening of human consciousness at the very beginning of humanity, and that still exists within us. Now, how it exists within us is a question. Is it just genetic? Is our psychology a product of a kind of genetic makeup? Or is there something that's even more mysterious? And I think that he left that as an open question, because he couldn't prove it to himself one way or another, and he didn't like to make assertions based on belief.
But having that belief that psychic reality was its own thing, to me, points in that direction.
So what I would like to do is, if it's okay, is read a chapter from the Red Book. So it's kind of like story time. It's a longish chapter. It's not the longest in the book. And I was looking at the shortest chapter, which is the one on death, but I thought it was kind of gruesome. And the nice thing about this is it really shows the three registers, I think, really clearly. It moves from a kind of more discursive, pastoral description of his surroundings to his dialogue to the more kind of conceptual level into this prophetic, romantic tone. So is that okay? Do we want to get up and walk around or take a drink? Or, all right?
What section is
It's
it?
a whole chapter?
Can I read along?
It's a whole chapter. You can read along, certainly.
That's a meditation practice.
This is actually meditation. Well, because for this week, I thought that I would give you just a snippet and let you meditate on it. And then I thought, well, the practice is a reading practice. It's reading, deep reading, and or sutra reading, but this is an extended reading that has many different levels to it. But I really thought that it was worth going into. Anyway, it's D's 2. It's the second day of his meeting with the anchorite. It's in Liber Secundus 22-23.
Do we have the reader's edition?
In the reader's edition, it's on page 253.
Yeah, but you didn't provide that in the reading. I didn't see that. Okay, I didn't think so. I was like, what? Do we have that? I have to buy it. $40.
It's online. It's easy to find.
Is it?
I should have sent it to you. I'm sorry, guys.
Let me search for it.
What page?
252 in the Reader's Edition. If you want to find it, located in Book 2, in Liber Secundus, by footnote, it's footnote 56 is at the bottom of the page. Sometimes it's easier to find it that way. Okay. So anchorites were the desert fathers, and others, I guess, were also considered anchorites. I don't know if there's a gendered term for the desert mothers, but these were the people that really kind of created monastic Christianity as we know it in the first centuries of the Common Era. And he meets, an anchorite comes to him in one of his visions, and then they break off, and then he has another encounter with him. I awaken, the day reddens the east. A night, a wonderful night in the distant depths of time lies behind me. In what faraway space was I? What did I dream? Of a white horse? It seems to me as if I had seen this white horse on the eastern sky over the rising sun. The horse spoke to me. What did it say? It said, "Hail him who is in darkness since the day is over him." There were 4 white horses, each with golden wings. They led the carriage of the sun on which Helios stood with flaring mane. I stood down in the gorge, astonished and frightened. 1,000 black serpents crawled swiftly into their holes. Helios ascended, rolling upward toward the wide paths of the sky. I knelt down, raised my hand suppliantly, and called, "Give us your light, you are flame-curled and twined, crucified and revived. Give us your light, your light." This cry awoke me. Didn't Ammonius is the anchor, didn't Ammonius say yesterday evening, "Do not forget to say your morning prayer when the sun rises"? I thought that perhaps he secretly worships the sun. Outside, a fresh morning wind rises. Yellow sand trickles in fine veins down the rocks. The redness expands across the sky, and I see the first rays shoot up to the firmament. Solemn calm and solitude on all sides. A large lizard lies on the stone and waits the sun. I stand as if spellbound and laboriously remember everything from yesterday, especially what Ammonius said. Well, what did he say? That the sequences of words have many meanings, and that John brought the Logos to man. But that does not sound properly Christian. Is he perhaps a Gnostic? No, that seems impossible to me, since they were really the worst of all the idolaters of words, as he would probably put it. The sun. What fills me with such inner exaltation? I should not forget my morning prayer, but where has my morning prayer gone? Dear sun, I have no prayer since I do not know how one must address you. Have I already prayed to the sun? But Ammonius really meant that I should pray to God at the break of day. He probably does not know. We have no more prayers. How should we know about our nakedness and poverty? What has happened to our prayers? I miss them here. This must really be because of the desert. It seems as if there ought to be prayers here. Is this desert so very bad? I think it's no worse than our cities. But why then do we not pray there? I must look toward the sun as if it had something to do with this. Alas, one can never escape the age-old dreams of mankind. What shall I do this whole morning long? I don't understand how Ammonius could have endured this life even for a year. I go back and forth on the dried-up riverbed and finally sit down on a boulder. Before me there are a few yellow grasses. Over there a small dark beetle is crawling along, pushing a ball in front of it, a scarab. You dear little animal, are you still toiling away in order to live your beautiful myth? How seriously and undiscouraged it works. If only you had a notion that you're performing an old myth, you would probably renounce your fantasies, as we men have also given up playing at mythology. The unreality nauseates me. What I say sounds very odd in this place, and the good Ammonius would certainly not agree with it. What am I actually doing here? No, I don't want to condemn him in advance, since I still haven't really understood what he actually means. He has a right to be heard. By the way, I thought differently yesterday. I was even very thankful to him that he wanted to teach me. But I'm being critical once again and superior, and may well learn nothing. His thoughts are not that bad at all. They're even good. I don't know why I always want to put the man down. Dear Beetle, where have you gone? I can no longer see you. Oh, you're already over there with your mythical ball. These little animals stick to things, quite unlike us. No doubt, no change of mind, no hesitation. Is this because they live their myth? Dear Scarab, my father, I honor you. Blessed be your work in eternity. Amen. What nonsense am I talking? I'm worshipping an animal. That must be because of the desert. It seems absolutely to command prayers. How beautiful it is here. The reddish color of the stones is wonderful. They reflect the glow of 100,000 past suns. These small grains of sand have rolled in fabulous primordial oceans. Over them swam primordial monsters with forms never beheld before. Where were you, man, in those days? On this warm sand lay your childish, primordial animal ancestors, like children snuggling up to their mother. Oh, Mother Stone, I love you. I lie snuggled up against your warm body, your late child. Blessed be you, ancient mother. Yours is my heart and all glory and power. Amen. What am I saying? That was the desert. How everything appears so animated to me. This place is truly terrible. These stones, are they stones? They seem to have gathered here deliberately. They're lined up like a troop transport. They've arranged themselves by size. The large ones stand apart. The small ones close ranks and gather in groups that precede the large ones. Here the stones form states. Am I dreaming or am I awake? It's hot. The sun already stands high. How the hours pass. Truly, the morning is nearly over. And how astonishing it's been. It is the sun, or is it these living stones, or is it the desert that makes my head buzz? I go up the valley, and before long I reach the hut of the anchorite. He's sitting on his mat, lost in deep reflection. Here's the dialogue. My father, I'm here. How have you spent your morning? I was surprised when you said that time passes quickly for you. I don't question you anymore, and this will no longer surprise me. I've learned a lot, but only enough to make you an even greater riddle than you were before. Why, all things that you must experience in the desert, you wonderful man. Even the stones are bound to speak to you. I'm happy that you've learned to understand something of the life of an anchorite. That will make our difficult task easier. I don't want to intrude on your mysteries, but I feel that you come from a strange world that has nothing to do with mine. You speak truthfully. I'm a stranger here, more foreign than any that you've ever seen. Even a man from Britain's remotest coast is closer to you than I am. Therefore have patience, Master, and let me drink from the source of your wisdom. Although the thirsty desert surrounds us, an invisible stream of living water flows here. Have you said your prayers? Master, forgive me, I tried, but I found no prayer. Yet I dreamed that I prayed to the rising sun. But don't worry yourself because of that. If you do find a word, your soul has nevertheless found inexpressible words to greet the break of day. But it was a heathen prayer to Helios. Let that suffice for you. But, O Master, I've prayed not only to the sun in such a dream, but in my absent-mindedness also to the scarab and to the earth. Be astonished at nothing, and in no case condemn or regret it. Let us go to work. Do you want to ask something about the conversation we had yesterday? I interrupted you yesterday when you spoke of Philo. You wanted to explain your notion of the various meanings of particular sequences of words. Well, I'll continue my account of how I was freed from the awful predicament of spinning words. A man my father had set free once came to me. This man, who I'd been attached to since my childhood, spoke to me, and by his father had set free, he was a slave, whom I'd been attached to since my childhood, spoke to me and said, "O Ammonius, are you well?" "Certainly," I said. "As you can see, I'm learned and have great success." He, "I mean, are you happy? Are you fully alive?" I laughed. "As you can see, all is well." The old man replied, "I saw how you lectured. You seemed to be anxious at the judgment of your listeners. You wove witty jokes into the lecture to please your listeners. You heaped up learned expressions to impress them. You were restless and hasty, as if still compelled to snatch up all knowledge. You're not in yourself." Although these words at first seemed laughable to me, they still made an impression on me, and reluctantly I had to credit the old man since he was right. Then he said, "Dear Ammonius, I have delightful tidings for you. God has become flesh in his Son and brought us all salvation." "What are you saying?" I called. "You probably mean Osiris, who shall appear in a mortal body." "No," he replied, "this man lived in Judea and was born from a virgin." I laughed and answered, "I already know about this. A Jewish trader has brought tidings of our virgin queen to Judea, whose image appears on the walls of one of our temples, and reported it as a fairy tale." "No," the old man insisted, "he was the son of God." "But then you mean Horus, the son of Osiris, don't you?" I answered. No, he wasn't Horus, the son of Osiris. Then you mean Horus, the son of Osiris, don't you? I answered. "No, he was not Horus, but a real man, and he was hung from a cross." "Oh, but this must be Seth, surely, whose punishment our old ones have often described." But the old man stood by his conviction and said, "He died and rose up on the third day." "Well, then he must be Osiris," I replied impatiently. "No," he cried, "he is called Jesus, the Anointed One." "Oh, you really mean this Jewish God whom the poor honor at the harbor, and whose unclean mysteries they celebrate in cellars?" "He was a man and yet the Son of God," said the old man, staring at me intently. "That nonsense, dear old man," I said, and showed him the door. But like an echo from distant rock faces, the words returned to me. A man and yet the Son of God. It seemed significant to me. And this phrase was what brought me to Christianity. And this is Jung again. "But don't you think that Christianity could ultimately be a transformation of your Egyptian teachings? If you say that our old teachings were less adequate expressions of Christianity, then I'm more likely to agree with you." "Yes, but do you then assume that the history of religions is aimed at a final goal?" "My father once bought a slave at the market from the region of the source of the Nile. He came from a country that had heard of neither Osiris nor the other gods. He told me many things in a more simple language that said the same as we believed about Osiris and the other gods. I learned to understand that those uneducated slaves unknowingly already possessed most of what the religions of the cultured peoples have developed into complete doctrines. Those able to read that language correctly could thus recognize in it not only the pagan doctrines, but also the doctrine of Jesus. And it's with this that I now occupy myself. I read the Gospels and seek their meaning which is yet to come. We know their meaning as it lies before us, but not their hidden meaning, which points to the future. It's erroneous to believe that religions differ in their innermost essence. Strictly speaking, it's always one and the same religion. Every subsequent form of religion is the meaning of the antecedent. Have you found out the meaning which is yet to come? No, not yet. It's very difficult, but I hope I'll succeed. Sometimes it seems to me that I need the stimulation of others, but I realize that those are temptations of Satan. Don't you believe that you'd succeed if you were nearer men? Perhaps you're right. But then he looked at me suddenly as if doubtful and suspicious. "But," he continues, "I love the desert, don't you understand? This yellow sun-glowing desert. Here you can see the countenance of the sun every day. You're alone. You can see glorious Helios." No, that's pagan. What's wrong with me? I'm confused. "You are Satan. I recognize you. Give way, adversary." He jumps up incensed and wants to lunge at me, but I'm far away from the 20th century. He who sleeps in the grave of the millennia dreams a wonderful dream. He dreams a primordially ancient dream. He dreams of the rising sun. If you sleep this sleep and dream this dream in this time of the world, you will know that the sun will also rise at this time. For the moment, we are still in the dark, but the day is upon us. He who comprehends the darkness in himself, to him the light is near. He who climbs down into his darkness reaches the staircase of the working light, fire-maned Helios. His chariot ascends with 4 white horses, his back bears no cross, and his side no wound, but he is safe and his head blazes in the fire. Nor is he a man of mockery, but of splendor and unquestionable force. I do not know what I speak. I speak in a dream. Support me, for I stagger, drunk with fire. I drank fire in this night since I climbed down through the centuries and plunged into the sun far at the bottom. And I rose up drunk from the sun with a burning countenance and my head ablaze. Give me your hand, a human hand, so that you can hold me to the earth with it, for whirling veins of fire swoop me up, and exultant longing tears me toward the zenith. But day is about to break, actual day, the day of this world, and I remain concealed in the gorge of the earth, deep down and solitary, and in the darkening shadows of the valley. That is the shadow and heaviness of the earth. How can I pray to the sun that rises far in the east over the desert? Why should I pray to it? I drink the sun within me, so why should I pray to it? But the desert in me demands prayers. Since the desert wants to satisfy itself with what is alive, I want to beg God for it, the sun, or one of the other immortals. I beg because I am empty and am a beggar. In the day of this world, I forget that I drank the sun and am drunk from its active light and singing its hour. But I stepped into the shadows of the earth and saw that I am naked and have nothing to cover my poverty. No sooner do you touch the earth than your inner life is over. It flees from you into things. And a wonderful life arises in things. What you thought was dead and inanimate betrays a secret life and silent, inexorable intent. You've got caught up in a hustle and bustle where everything goes its own way with strange gestures, beside you, above you, beneath you, through you. Even the stones speak to you, and magical threads spin from you to things and from things to you. Far and near work within you, and you work in a dark manner upon the near and the far, and you are always helpless and a prey. But if you watch closely, you will see what you have never seen before, namely, that things live your life, that they live off you. The river bears your life to the valley. One stone falls upon another with your force. Plants and animals also grow through you, and they are the cause of your death. A leaf dancing in the wind dances with you. The irrational animal guesses your thoughts and represents you. The whole earth sucks its life from you, and everything reflects you again. Nothing happens in which you are not entangled in a secret manner, for everything has ordered itself around you and plays your innermost. Nothing in you is hidden to things, no matter how remote, how precious, how secret it is. It inheres in things. Your dog robs you of your father, who passed away long ago, and looks at you as he did. The cow in the meadow has intuited your mother and charms you with total calm and security. The stars whisper your deepest mysteries to you, and the soft valleys of the earth rescue you in a motherly womb. Like a stray child, you stand pitifully among the mighty, who hold the threads of your life. You cry for help and attach yourself to the first person that comes your way. Perhaps he can advise you. Perhaps he knows the thought that you do not have, and which all things have sucked out of you. I know that you would like to hear the tidings of he whom things have not lived, but who lived and fulfilled himself. For you are a son of the earth, sucked dry by the suckling earth. I can suck nothing out of itself, but suckles only from the sun. Therefore you would like to have tidings of the sun, which shines and does not suckle. You would like to hear of the Son of God, who shone and gave, who begot, and to whom life was born again, and the earth bears the sun, green and colorful children. You would like to hear of him, the radiating Savior, who was a son of the sun, cut through the webs of the earth, who sundered the magic threads and released those in bondage, who owned himself and was no man's servant, who sucked no one dry, and whose treasure no one exhausted. You would like to hear of him who was not darkened by the shadow of earth, but illuminated it, who saw the thoughts of all, and whose thoughts no one guessed, who possessed in himself the meaning of all things, and whose meaning no thing could express. The solitary fled the world. He closed his eyes, plugged his ears, and buried himself in a cave within himself, but it was no use. The desert sucked him dry. The stones spoke his thoughts. The cave echoed his feelings, and so he himself became desert, stone, and cave. And it was all emptiness and desert, and helplessness and barrenness, since he did not shine and remained a son of the earth, who sucked a book dry and was sucked empty by the desert. He was desire and not splendor, completely earth and not sun. Consequently, he was in the desert as a clever saint who very well knew that otherwise he was no different from the other sons of the earth. If he would have drunk of himself, he would have drunk fire. The solitary went into the desert to find himself, but he did not want to find himself, but rather the manifold meaning of Holy Scripture. You can suck the immensity of the small and the great into yourself, and you will become emptier and emptier, since immense fullness and immense emptiness are one and the same. He wanted to find what he needed in the outer, but you find manifold meaning only in yourself, not in things, since the manifoldness of meaning is not something that is given at the same time, but is a succession of meanings. The meanings that follow one another do not lie in things, but lie in you, who are subject to many changes, insofar as you take part in life. Things also change, but you do not notice this if you do not change. But if you change, the countenance of the world alters. The manifold sense of things is your manifold sense. It is useless to fathom it in things, and this probably explains why the solitary went into the desert and fathomed a thing but not himself. And therefore, what happened to every desirous solitary also happened to him. The devil came to him with smooth tongue and clear reasoning, and knew the right word at the right moment. He lured him to his desire. I had to appear to him as the devil, since I had accepted my darkness. I ate the earth, and I drank the sun, and I became a greening tree that stands alone and grows.
You're a wonderful reader.
Yes, you are, really.
So, sorry it took so long. I kind of felt like the book required the whole thing being read so that you could get a sense of what he was attempting to do.
So what was this step? I mean, this was one episode.
Right. So his technique of active imagination was, Sonu Shamdasani's put it in a really funny way. He said, he was a man of Europe, Middle Europe, in the late 19th century and early 20th century. So after dinner, he'd retire to his library with his cigar, and his pipe, and his whiskey, and he would take a sip of the whiskey, and then he would go into a kind of meditative state. And he would allow the images, if we close our eyes and get quiet, I don't know whether other people do, but I just see this constant movement, this sea, this river of images just passing, and he learned to interact with what came his way. And then he took notes in what he called his black books, and eventually translated the black books, or transcribed them into this. So this was just one of the figures that he met. He also noticed over time that the figures changed as his consciousness changed, as his psychology changed. And the anchorite represented kind of an iteration of Elijah, in a transformation of Elijah. And eventually Elijah comes back. The figures kind of bleed into one another. But he's part of the shadow and wisdom figure, the masculine side, the logos side of his personality. And this is just one encounter. And at the end of each encounter, he goes into this he writes about it in a kind of a... Yeah, but it's poetic at the same time, but it's analytic, and then he falls into this deeper register where it becomes a religious experience.
So what you read was only the visionary part? After this is the analytical part, and this included...
No, it's all...
It included both, right? Yeah, so it's sort of woven into each other.
Right. At the end of this book, there's a chapter called Scrutinies, which is maybe 100 pages at the end, where he attempts to actually go into the material and organize it. And he talks about ego and shadow and anima and animus and monofigure, and he attempts to kind of make more sense out of it. And then he attempted to teach it. And then in 1929, he received an alchemical document from Richard Wilhelm, The Secret of the Golden Flower, and he said, my goodness, people have been doing this sort of thing long before I was. And then he realized he no longer needed to teach it from a personal perspective, because some of this stuff he found embarrassing. And he wasn't sure if the world would accept it. They would see him as being kind of a madman, and he didn't want to be seen as a prophet. He wanted to be seen as a physician. So the rest of his life, as it said in one of the slides, that this was the prima materia for the work of the rest of his life. And he said in an interview with Miguel Serrano in like 1956 or 7, towards the end of his life, that the rest of his work were essentially field notes for further researches in the material that he came up with while he was doing this. So the entire gamut, although he's continued to work on the Pinocchio, and he never quite felt like he effectively got to that point where he was a completely integrated person. And maybe he would have been different if he had that profound a transformation. He felt that that transformation can only take place in death. And he felt that he had made himself conscious enough that he would survive the death process. He didn't know for how long, or if he would just be kind of hung out there to dry. It's like maybe there's nothing on the other side. He had his beliefs, but he couldn't prove anything. Because he couldn't prove anything, he wasn't sure what he would see. But he does talk about it in various places, not in the Red Book. This is too early. Anything else? Questions or responses?
When he's,
Sorry.
sorry, when he's talking about the desert, was he in Egypt?
Mm-hmm.
But it's all in his mind.
It's in his mind.
Oh, it's all in
He's
his mind.
imagining.
He's imagining that he's with this anchorite in 1st century or 2nd century Egypt, in the Egyptian desert. Around the period of St. Anthony.
I've written 2 papers about him. I really, I'm fond of him, despite his deep racism. I think he was very flawless. I have a little story. I was writing a paper, my last paper, it's titled Understanding Whiteness, Understanding Trump or something, the Indian investigation. And I was up in Inverness, excuse me, I was up in Inverness, up by Point Reyes, writing this paper because I had to get away from the internet. You know, I just had Facebook. So I went up to the land, and I'm sitting there writing in the back patio, and there's a tree in the distance, and there's a knot in it. And I'm writing, and I look at that knot, and I'm writing, and by the 3rd day, that knot in the tree was gone. It was the picture, that picture of him looking down, mustache, cigarette. I have it. Not many people can see it, but I was like, oh my God, you came to help with the paper, you know, and he's just there. And
Was it Jung or was it God?
well, good question. Maybe they're one of the same. But I feel like he was a bit tormented, actually. I feel that he was trapped by his whiteness and his European, you know, rationality, his desire to be an empiricist. I feel like he constrained himself to fit the beliefs of the day. And I don't know if he's walking around now what he would be like, what further insights he would have. But I think the confrontation with the shadow and the unfathomableness of it all was a bit too much in a way, and he retreated into mind in a lot of ways. But when you see that, you can't unsee it. And I think that's why Dreams, Memories, and Reflections reads like a piece of literature and not science, because he had the foot in that realm and he couldn't get it out, although he wanted to. That's my impression.
Yeah, he says it in the prologue. He says man is not a scientific object. We're more easily understood using myth as a way of understanding this.
Yeah, I'm with Angela on that. I wonder, you know, who he would be like if he had gone in that direction. And you know, like you said, he chose to be seen as a doctor. He wanted his contribution to be in the realm of a new science called psychology that he was instrumental in creating. And that in order to give the science legitimacy, he needed to hide and closet all of these parts of himself that were what gave the impetus to all of his science, you know, and all of these insights. But it's such a loss, I think, for the field of psychology in a way that he had to hide it so much, because he could have inspired a different way of, like, Freud was so, talk about one extreme, and I think Jung was in the other extreme, trying to get to the middle. His face, his persona that he was presenting was in the middle of these two extremes, but his soul was on the other side, So it was this cool. I wonder what it could have been like, what he could be now.
I will say this, that I've read his collected works 4 times through. I've read this 5 times, and his letters and seminars. And since I was a child, I first encountered his work when I was 11 years old. I read an essay by Marie-Louise von Franz in this encyclopedia set called Man, Myth, and Magic.
What's an encyclopedia?
Encyclopedia Man, Myth, and Magic, very cool. And she wrote an entry on fairy tales and I think an entry on myth. And of all the articles in that encyclopedia, and it was 24 volumes, that was the one that grabbed me. And so I've always been Jungian, I guess. And when I saw things in his writing that I felt other people weren't seeing or allowing themselves to see. And when I read this, I was like, yeah, of course. And there's so much literature that's been written in the wake of this saying, you see what Jung was actually really trying to say. But I think that many of the people that are making those comments haven't read his work thoroughly, and who would want to read 18 volumes of his collected works, and sometimes having to read it multiple times in order to understand what he was trying to get at without saying it. And he tied himself up in knots sometimes. And yet, if you read his, like something like Mysterium Connotationis or the Alchemy as a Religious Experience or something, I can't remember what it's called, the religious problems in alchemy, they're numinous and luminous, and he'll go through this, he'll like give you this kind of exegesis, he'll talk, it's very discursive, and then suddenly you're in the soup and you're like wondering where he's going and you're feeling a little bit lost, and then suddenly there's this explosion of light, and this statement just comes out of him, and you're affixed by it, and then you start reading and he's back in the discursive mode again. So he said that he wrote everything with a double bottom. These experiences never left him, but he wrote like an alchemist in a kind of in a coded language, which can be frustrating, I think, unless for whatever reason it was just water to me. But I don't think that that's for everybody. We all have schools of thought or particular writers that just do it for us. First von Franz, but then when I finally was able to read Jung when I was a little bit older, and you see that the stuff that, the knowledge base that you need to just kind of understand his references.
11 years old, you're reading Jung. Okay, dude.
That's
gonna be too
my first
right
book.
there.
My first book by him was Mysterium Connotationis, and I picked it up and I said, okay, right. And I got 1 page in, and I was like, huh? It's like, what is this Greek? This is all Greek to me. Oh, it is Greek. So I had to put it down. But von Franz, I found, was a really wonderful way to move in, and he said of her that she was the only one of his students that really understood his work. So she's a good entrance point, because she speaks in a much simpler language. She distilled it.
So what about the content as a cognitive meditation?
Well,
Anybody want to say something?
I mean, it's, I feel like his work, I haven't read that cover to cover, but I've read snippets of it, but he does a type of poetic inquiry, really.
So
He
you
goes into,
that's a good way of putting it. Poetic inquiry.
it is.
Would you like to write your dissertation like that?
Well, we've
It's
talked
an
about,
interesting-
it is a very powerful way to make meaning. I recently wrote an essay about a very painful experience I've had, and it came out in poetry with citations. But it was a way to tap into first of all, to get through the process, and then to unearth the meaning. Why am I going through this thing? And so I feel like this is a bit of poetic inquiry.
I think that's an important point. It's something worth reflecting on.
Yeah.
Then what about what about this passage and as a piece of cognitive meditation? Anybody has anything to say about it? The content.
I felt it was transporting. I felt, when he's describing the golden rocks that reflect 1,000 suns and the grains of sand, and I felt like I was there, and the beetle that moved from one place to the other. There was this transporting quality to transcend one's experience of the classroom into going into the space where he was at. And then listening to the conversation he was having with, what's his name? And the dialogue and it was really interesting. And I kept on having you at the back of my head also, this is not a teaching, and the whole process that he was going through was like a distillation and a discovery and an excavation of a lot of different concepts that he was grappling with, and he was personifying them. So the experience felt very embodied in a sense. I can imagine how, for him, it was this projection process where he was really grappling with these ideas in a way that was very meaningful and deep, and using the narrative aspect as a tool to go deeper, because then he goes and comes at it from a different aspect, right? So there's layers and layers, it's first he's in this place, and then his almost embodied experience of the prayers and what comes out of him, these prayers that he feels are almost heretic, they go against his training as a Christian, but that's what comes out of him, and then his discussion back and forth as, between the two characters, and then the reflection on that, and the analysis of it. It's really, I felt it was a really interesting process that he went, like an illustration of his process, in addition to a beautiful reading with a lot to meditate on.
Mike?
One of the things that came up for me was exploration, and you said another X word. I didn't just now.
Excavation.
Excavation, yeah. So exploration was the word that came up for me. It was almost playful to me, where it wasn't a forceful hammer. It's like, let's play with this and let's see where this goes. Let's explore the desert and the imagery with that as well. Makes it, to me, made it come that much more alive. I'll be honest, I don't normally like sitting and hearing somebody just read from a text, and I've only read little bits and pieces of the Red Book, and it made it a lot more interesting for me. It kept my attention, because it was like, yeah, let's play with this journey that we're walking on, that we're experiencing, and the conversations that are being had.
He says that when this kind of upwelling of his unconscious material began, he didn't know what to do. He actually left his job, he stopped his association with Freud, and the first thing that he did was he remembered when he was a child how he used to love to play in the sand, and he used to love to build with blocks. So he did what he called his waterworks. He would go out into his yard and he would dig channels and canals, and he would put up stones and he would build towns. Now, he's on his hands and knees basically playing with blocks in the sand, and he thought the people that saw him doing this must think that he's mad. His own family were wondering what was going on, but he was moving back into his childhood connection to the imaginal. So it was play.
Yeah. And he talks about that in the Memories, Dreams, and Reflections too.
Well, what came out of this when he attempted to kind of create a therapeutic model out of this was he developed what later has come to be expressive arts therapy, drama therapy, movement therapy, sand trade therapy. He's the one that kind of catalyzed or created. I mean, he was the genesis of all of those types of therapy that are now considered arts therapy. And it was all because he himself decided the only way that I'm going to get back is to play.
Yes.
So yeah, I really hit on something that I support.
He's also very, this is also a contemplation on Christianity, and he's very skeptical of Christianity. And in Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, he has a lot of tension. His father is a parson. He feels frightened by the men dressed in their cloaks, and he is very torn between this kind of primitive mind and the Christian mind. So to me, that's a dialogue between what is God, what is Christianity, and then of course answer to Job. You feel a lot of that in answer to Job, of like, what does this all really mean? So to me, it's a contemplation on religion, Christianity.
Sergio?
So I've stumbled, it seems like that's a theme for me, stumbled with the word cognition here, because when you say practice of cognition, what it comes to my mind is thinking, right? But then you started by talking about the Mahavakyas and the sutras, and even the koans. That was one of the pieces that we read for it, that is using your thinking to go beyond your thinking. So there's a way in what you read to me, there's a part of my mind that wants to follow this story, right? Okay, there should be a logic here. There's a logic here somewhere. There's a storyline that's somewhere here. And then whoop, something happens, like in a dream, like whoop, and something flips. It's almost like reading either the Upanishads, in the other class we're talking about it, poetic, imaginal, or Alice in Wonderland. Like in the way it's tricking your mind like a koan to get you beyond the mind, to get you to other realms, and you start connecting things in ways. So I don't know if that speaks to practice of cognition, but that's the way I see using the mind to go beyond the mind.
I think it's woven into it, right? Those are the kind of, he's actually trying to make sense as he's imagining.
Yeah.
That both of them are woven in.
Yes. And to Jung, it's a dialectic. It's kind of Hegelian in a way, right? You have one thing, and then its opposite, and now they're in tension with one another, and they're struggling for dominance. And if you fall into one or the other, right? This is what is it called? There's something on perfect mind from the Zen tradition that says the great way is not difficult, it only requires us not to choose. So he has this tension set up, and then if it's held long enough, the symbol appears between them, superior to them, and then you move beyond that discursive way of seeing things into the symbol. But the symbol reifies, and then another shadow element of that appears, and now you're caught in this new tension. And to Jung, that never ends. It never ends.
That dialectically.
Dialectic. But you never get to ultimately become Brahman in Jung's psychology until you die. And even then.
No, I found it really fascinating from a number of points of view. And mainly that whatever you chose to read was about the Helios, which is really the center of the entire Indo-European tradition, and also to the Egyptian, And I think he's kind of he's chosen the two traditions here, the Egyptian and the Christian, but it sort of also speaks to the Vedic tradition. I mean, and that Upanishadic course that Sergio is referring to, a lot of it is about that, right? About the three births of the sun. And, is the sun above? Is the sun within? Is the sun in the earth? And the other thing I felt was this choice of existential nakedness. The choice of the desert. And then the fact that he makes a comparison between that and the city of today, and says, is this also the desert? Right. So it's really, this is the desert in a certain sense, if we want to make it so. If we want to be naked to the Helios. And then the prayers, that is this a prayer, is this not a prayer? Am I one with it, or am I calling to it? And do we exhaust the Helios, by naming it the Helios. I think all these, it's very fascinating, all these questions. It's, the hermeneutics of this is part of the cognition of this. And the hermeneutics of this is contemplative because it doesn't give an answer. It's like you were saying, he refuses to really put an answer to it. The process itself is a poetic inquiry because it's an inquiry but remains poetic.
And there's another level, this is what I kind of followed in my dissertation, and that is that behind every statement that Jung makes is about 10,000 pages of reading and life experience. But so just that, you know, it's like he read what was available to him on the Upanishads. He read everything that was available from the Gnostic tradition. He understood the Egyptian tradition. He had read everything that was available to him. And so all of that is packed in there in a few words. But he can't give you everything. I appreciate that about him because I don't have that ability. It's like I want to kind of take every word, split it in the middle, and then pack everything else inside it. So my dissertation was 350 pages. I don't recommend that. But you can see, and you see it in the footnotes, the Shamdasani's footnotes, you know, on every single page. Or if you look at Jung's collected works, like Mysterium Connotationis is almost more footnotes than it is text. So the amount of erudition that goes behind these statements is also present. Even though it's poetic and evocative, there's also this immense learning that exists.
There's also some of it's channeled too.
So actually, I met Shamdasani I was studying this at a talk in Los Angeles, and he's really it's not just only a psychologist, he's a cultural philosopher. So he was talking about the fact of this period of time when this was happening, being the heyday of surrealism. So it was a movement where poetic inquiry was being done by many others as well. It was the attempt to open up a new kind of language, to look into ourselves. You know. And I think maybe we are at a point of time when we need to open up that kind of language in our inquiry.
Thank you so much. It's beautiful. I like that font.
Thanks for listening. I know it's a lot to take in.
Just contemplating it.
It was very good.